All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to class 10, I believe, in this series. So there's 6 more after today. There's 16, no, 5 more after today. Right? Um, no, no, 6 more. So 6 more after today. Um, so I mentioned there'd be some changes, in the schedule. We're inviting new people to come to teach different things. Venerable Yunton will be here. She's teaching 3 Saturdays, the 20th, 27th, and then there's a retreat that covers January 3rd. So actually, after today, the next class will be January 17th, because we're just going to keep the normal. We could do the 10th, but I probably need a little bit of a break after all of, so the 17th and then the 31st. Will be the next 2 after today, and then there'll be some changes in January and February and March too. So unavoidably, we brought other people in, and so the schedule changes a little bit. Okay, so the topic for today is an interesting topic. There's a lot. Buddhism has a lot to say about this topic, which is forgiveness. We've had a class on patience, and there's overlap between those two. The concept of forgiveness, you don't specifically find, I think it's an interesting, the word I think is a modern English word that they didn't, I don't think that they had in Sanskrit or Tibetan. But you find the idea of resentment, comes up in Buddhism, and the idea of patience comes up in Buddhism. So there's overlap, between the training in patience is something that we've talked about. And training in patience, what's different about this idea of forgiveness versus training in patience is that, in a way, training in patience is what we do in order to be able to remain undisturbed when a difficult situation is arising. And forgiveness comes into play kind of after the fact, right? So this could be things that have already happened, to us, resentments that we've carried from earlier. And in a way, it's if we, so training in patience, if we're really successful in our training in patience, then perhaps we can recognize that, we're not holding on to resentment. There's no resentment there already that is related to what we would be forgiving. But of course, as ordinary sentient beings, our practice of patience is limited right now. And we're going to go through life, and there are going to be times when we feel harmed by someone and we feel like, what do I do now that I feel harmed, now that I, feel like I'm on the receiving end of some difficulty, some harm that I've received. So patience, in a way, is related, because anger and resentment are the things that we're trying to work with, either with the practice of patience or with the practice of forgiveness. So it does, it comes up with them. I don't know how easily you can feel all of these. So, but I am going to go in this class I'm going to go in a little bit more we're going to look at similar ideas that we looked at in the class on patience. We're going to look at them in a slightly different way. And to some degree, probably, I think we'll include aspects that are more historically Buddhist in there. There's some things that I'm not going to include, but to some degree, I think we'll bring in a little bit more of the traditional Buddhist philosophical view when we're looking at this idea of forgiveness. So anger, is the close enemy of patience, and also this idea of forgiveness, being able to forgive, because when we have trouble forgiving, or we have trouble practicing patience, it is because we're holding on to resentment or anger. And as we can see here, anger is rooted in the three poisons from the Buddhist perspective. Holding on to anger is rooted in the fact that we ourselves are subject to the three poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So the concept of fundamental ignorance is quite a complicated topic in Buddhism that we won't really be able to explore too deeply, but the understanding from the perspective of fundamental ignorance is that we don't see clearly. We don't see any situation that we're going through, through the eyes of wisdom. We see it through the eyes or the lens of ignorance, which you can bring in to the practice of patience and forgiveness. In the sense, if you want to take the view of karma, on board, then from that perspective, our experiences are the expression of past karmic action. And this is one way that Buddhists work with anger, seeing what is arising in our lives presently as the manifestation of past causes and conditions that we ourselves, generally speaking, these are causes and conditions that occurred in past lives. So first you have to take on board, if you want to, the idea of past and future lives. But if and when we experience the ripening result of past karma, then if that past karma was negative, then the ripening result of that past karma will be experienced as negative, that the causes and the conditions of that past karma were positive, then the ripening experience of those past karmic causes and conditions will be positive. So we have to be skillful here in terms of thinking about it in terms of blaming oneself. That's certainly not the goal. Just like when you leave your house and you forget you don't have your car keys, or you don't have something, you don't have the stick, the memory stick that you needed for a presentation at work or something, and you're like, oh, you don't think, oh, I'm such a terrible person, I'm awful, but you just think, oh, I'm experiencing this because in the past I forgot to bring it with me. I made a mistake, right? I could have remembered to bring this thing that I needed, and I forgot. So next time I'll try to remember. Next time, I will use this as a learning opportunity. And next time I'll try to do better, and I'll try to remember to bring what I need to have, what I need. So thinking about in terms of just the fact that we do engage in mistaken actions under the influence of all of these afflicted states, we experience confusion and ignorance, we experience strong attachment. And then when attachment, which is, a neediness, a clinging to getting what we want, getting what we find desirable, And then aversion or anger is what happens in the mind when our attachments are thwarted, when we don't get what we want, when we're prevented from getting what we want. We feel a sense of aversion, of anger, of needing to push away the unpleasant experience. So anger is rooted in all of these afflicted states of mind. And so what is important then is that when we understand forgiveness, we can see, that we need to be skillful here, because forgiveness doesn't mean putting ourselves again and again in unhealthy situations, in situations that might be dangerous or harmful to oneself, because we have the boundaries that we have. And of course, we've talked about boundaries, and we've talked about the reasonableness of setting boundaries in the past. And there's nothing wrong with setting boundaries, needing to set boundaries. We can understand, though, that our boundaries are related to our present sense of ego identity, right? And so over time, our present sense of ego identity might soften, might shift, and that means that our boundaries can shift. We may find it intolerable to deal with certain things now. And in 10 years from now, we might be like, oh, I can't believe that used to bother me so much. When people would say those, we may hold on to political views, or, views about our religion, or we may label ourselves or define ourselves in certain ways, and not really be able to tolerate other people's different points of view on that. And then later on, we might think, oh, well, of course, I can, other people have their own points of view, and I don't need to get so worked up about what people think or say in relation to my ego identity in that way. So our boundaries can certainly shift over time, but of course, there are certain boundaries, like not dealing with mental or physical abuse, verbal abuse, things of that nature. And those, of course, I think even with those extremely high level spiritual practitioners, it's still related to ego identity, but we need to not, engage in spiritual bypassing. We need to not just say, oh, well, this ideal of the Bodhisattva, this ideal of the Buddha, that's something that I can take on board today. And therefore, we find in different sutras and scriptures and things, this idea of, well, sentient beings can do what they like, with my body, and if we take that on board too soon, or, without actually creating the causes for that, then that's not skillful either. So there are certain boundaries that are quite reasonable and that we do need to maintain over time. So, we don't need to agree with actions that other people are engaging in. But we talked about how we try, from the Buddhist perspective, we always try to separate the person, the essence of the person, from their harmful actions. We can condemn harmful actions while respecting the basic goodness of the individual, and see that we talked about seeing their Buddha nature, their Buddha potential, seeing that, yes, they're engaging in harmful actions right now, but they themselves are only the influence of anger and attachment and aversion, and they have the capacity to grow, and maybe they will destroy harmful actions if and when new causes and conditions ripen in their own life. But still, we may need to keep healthy boundaries, we may need to maintain some distance. But what we're trying to essentially do is recognize that holding on to resentment with this idea of forgiveness holding on to resentment is something that harms oneself. That um, as we are maintaining healthy boundaries, as we are maintaining maybe a sense of separating or not engaging, we're doing it through the lens of holding oneself with compassion, holding the other person with compassion, not labeling them as other, not labeling them as, this um, person who is a bad person because they're engaging in actions that we dislike or that we find difficult. Okay, so these are two examples from the different sutras of the Buddha. One that can help us as we try to relate to seeing other people through the lens of compassion, which is this first story of the stick, right? So in this story, someone was getting beat, by another person, and they were using a stick. They were literally hitting them with a stick. And if we ourselves experience, and that doesn't have to be physical or verbal abuse, but when we experience harm that's coming to us from another person, we all recognize that it would be irrational for our anger to be placed on the instrument that they're using, right? If they're using a physical branch to hit us with, we wouldn't then be directing our anger toward that instrument that's being used. But when we recognize that the other sentient being, because the problem is that we then we see that, we see the logic of that, but still we put our anger on the person, the sentient being who's wielding the stick, who's holding the stick and using it, because we feel like there's a difference in the agency of the stick versus the sentient being wielding the stick. And we think that the sentient being wielding the stick is the proper target of our anger and not their instrument. But if we can really reflect on those three poisons and we can see how those three poisons operate in our own lives, and we can see how we ourselves um, really don't have agency often when the three poisons are arising in our own lives. If we could choose never to raise our voice to others, if we could choose never to say or do an unkind thing, we would. Like if that was within our power, our capacity to go through the rest of our lives and never be insulting, never be belittling, never, try to um, strike, another person either physically or verbally, emotionally. Of course, we would recognize that would be amazing. And yet we do that from time to time because the afflictions are arising so strongly in the mind. In that moment, it is as if we don't have the agency that we would normally have. It is as if we're not able to choose, oh, I see anger arising in my mind and I choose not to follow it. I choose not. Now, of course, from the Buddhist perspective, we can eventually, after many, many years of practice, and probably many lifetimes of practice, we can get to a point where that might be open to us. But we can see that that's something that we struggle with. So we should think that other people struggle with that too. And we should see them as the instrument of their afflictions, right? And so in that moment, they're like the stick, they're being wielded almost without control by their inability to rein in the afflictions that are arising in their mind, which makes them an object of love and compassion, because we see that when we experience the afflictions, we suffer, and when they're experiencing the afflictions, they are suffering. And so rather than seeing them as the target of hatred, we see them as the target of our love and compassion. Um, we see them as just being totally under the influence in the same way that the stick, was just laying there on the ground and they had to pick it up. And, we're actually it is actually the stick that's harming us, right? They're over here, right? And there's only physical contact with the stick. So we're actually receiving harm from the stick. And in the same way, their physical body and their mind are totally overtaken by the afflictions. So it's the afflictions ultimately that are causing us harm, right? So if we're going to direct anything, we should direct it at what's actually motivating their actions, just like we think what's motivating the movement of the stick is their body and their mind. But if their body and their mind are entirely under the influence of the afflictions, then that should be where, where we direct our attention. And then that should lead us to think, I need to uproot the afflictions in my own mind so that I can help all other sentient beings uproot the afflictions in their minds. Because ultimately, if they were free of the afflictions, then they would never have given, the anger would never have arisen in their mind. This violence, would never have occurred to them because they'd be completely free of the actual cause of their angry outbursts. Okay, and then the second one, or the second story here from the sutra, is where the Buddha was, giving a teaching, and there was a person who came up to him, very much, again, under the influence of anger, hurling these insults toward the Buddha. Um, and, the Buddha asks this person, if you buy someone a gift, if you they had stores 2,600 years ago, but you make them something, or you do something, and you wrap it up, and you're like, here, and they're like, no, no, thank you, I'm okay, I don't need this, and then the Buddha was like, who does that belong to? Like, you intended to give it to this person, and they're like, well, if they don't accept it, then it still belongs to me. It's still mine, right? I tried to give it to them. So, and the Buddha was like, well, in the same way, I don't accept your hurling these insults at me. I'm not going to take this on board as something that's validly mine. You want me to see it that way. You want me to be the recipient of your anger, but I don't accept it. So in the same way, it belongs to you. This is your anger. And of course, this is a similar way that we think, but this is, from the Buddha, where he's recognizing that we don't have to, take on board the criticisms of others, the anger of others. We can just think, well, something must be going on. In the same way, in terms of thinking about the afflictions, we can think, well, something is going on in their own lives. Maybe, um, they had a bad day. Maybe they're really stressed out. They don't have the spaciousness. They don't have the capacity to relate to me in a different way. So I just don't take this on board. I'm leaving this with them. This is just something that's happening in their own mind. And I don't have to, feel as though I'm actually the recipient of what they want me to feel or how they want me to feel. They're trying to make me feel angry or upset or insulted. But if I just see it as that which is happening in their own mind, I can let it be. I can let it just stay with them, and it doesn't need to actually affect me. Okay, and then this is another way of thinking, another thing that we can use. This is a quote from Shantideva in his guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. Um, so this is talking about, so this is another way of thinking about um, letting go of resentment, which is to think about what is it costing me? What is, who is the one that's harmed by holding on to resentment, holding on to anger. And we think, well, really, I'm the one that's ultimately being harmed. The other person probably doesn't care. They said or did whatever they said or did that negatively impacted me. And then I'm the one with this grudge. I'm the one with this resentment, and ruminating on it, bringing it up again and again and again, is only damaging, my own mind. And there's different ways of thinking about this from the Buddhist. This is a little bit more of a Buddhist perspective, um, where they talk about this idea of merit. This idea of merit comes up a lot in Buddhism, which is sort of like positive, um, energetic potential of the mind. Like when we engage in a lot of virtuous activities, and then we build up this kind of momentum in a spiritual, useful, positive direction, then by thinking about hatred and anger and ruminating on that, we we kind of destroy a lot of that positive, energetic direction or spiritual momentum that we cultivate through our virtue. So if we think about how harmful it is to hold on to it and who is really the one who is harmed by holding on to it, then that is something that we can use in our practice to think, well, if I can reframe this situation, and because we talked about how Buddhism is not about repression, but it's about awareness and transformation, right? So we analyze the fact that we feel harmed, and then we recognize that holding on to a real sense of a grudge or this damaged, seeing them as the object of our hatred, the object of our anger, um, is only going to negatively impact my own mind, and that can help us to be motivated to see it in a different way. Maybe that's the chapter on patience in the ways I described. Okay, right. So we're going to go through now this way of thinking about putting this together, these different ways of relating to anger. So again, we see it, if we see anger, if we see anger as positive, as something, this idea, and again, this comes up in our culture a lot, which is really different from how it's understood in Buddhism. The question isn't whether or not our anger is justified. The question is whether or not our anger is useful, whether or not our anger is positive or constructive or beneficial. Of course, we may feel that, when I am on the receiving end of this, that I have no choice, or that it's reasonable, or that I ought to respond in anger. And it isn't to say that we shouldn't respond at all, but how do we respond? Do we respond by returning harm with harm, or do we respond with wisdom and love and compassion and so on? So the first step, again, is this idea uh, so, thinking about I don't know, my readers are on and I can't really see that far away. So, yeah. So the first step is to think about, who's really harmed. And then the second step is, again, to really be pragmatic about it. Like, and this again comes from Shantideva, if I'm experiencing some difficulty and I can find a way out of it, there's something I can say or do, well, then do that. Like if it's ethical and it's not harmful, if I can express a boundary to the other person, if I can help them to see, the impact of their actions, and encourage them to engage in some other course of action, well, then of course I should, that's perfectly reasonable to say, when you do this, I feel like this, I would appreciate it, if in the future you could respond in a different way. If you can work on a solution, if you can find a solution, well, great. But some things don't have solutions, right? Some really big social problems, yes, we can maybe try to get involved and maybe try to make something a little bit better, but ultimately that large social issue probably will still be there as we're trying to, engage in helping some people deal with it in some way. And if, and so if there's nothing that we can do, then we need to uh, go back to not seeing the people that we hold responsible for that as the object of our anger, but again, through the lens of seeing them as the object of our love and compassion. Yeah. Then the third point here is we recognize that when we go back to the three poisons and we recognize anger, and attachment and ignorance, we think, well, I'm an ordinary sentient being. I'm entirely surrounded by ordinary sentient beings. And so the nature of this ordinary plane of existence is to meet with difficulties and obstacles again and again and again, right? It's the fact that I don't want to. It's the fact that I'm attached to only experiencing comfort, only hearing ego-pleasing words, only, having comfort and peace of mind, and expecting that everyone that I meet is going to play into those expectations. When that expectation is thwarted, that's what gives rise to anger. When we go through life expecting everyone else to just go along, agree with me, see this world the way that I do, um, only say and do the things that please me, then we're going to be disappointed and we're going to um, want to respond to that with anger in order to try to manipulate the situation and to cause it to be otherwise. When in fact it is what it is. We are surrounded by countless other ordinary sentient beings who are all struggling with all of these afflictions that we ourselves are struggling with. And so we have to understand that there is no choice but to experience these difficulties again and again and again. Um, and to really think about, am I holding on to an unrealistic view that's causing me to suffer? Okay. And so the second step then is um, like I said, I can't know. I wasn't kidding. Okay, so, right, so again, this is just recapping um, our inclination to blame others. So again, we see them as being under the influence of the afflictions. Um, we, we look at ourselves and we think, well, why do I experience anger? It's because I've set myself up as a target for other people. Um, and there's different ways, of relating to this idea of the target. Um, one is, again, the unrealistic expectations that we hold, that we go through life holding. The other is our ego identity itself, thinking of our own interests as being paramount and how everything, should go along and should support our preferences and our desires and our interests, and how unrealistic that is. Um, and if there was this idea of the target is, of course, other people might be hurling things in our direction, but if there's nothing there for it to hit, then it's just going to keep going, right? This idea, and again, that could be the idea of saying, well, this belongs to you, this doesn't belong to me. This idea of working with an understanding our expectations, our unrealistic expectations, our unrealistic boundaries, because it's just thoughts that other people are having that they are sending in our direction. And if we're not holding ourselves so tightly, then that is just going to keep moving. It's just words, it's just sound that we're hearing, but we don't take it on board in this way that really generates intense emotional reaction in our own mind. And then the third, if we want to, to whatever degree, what we want to, thinking about it as the ripening of our own karmic experience. So we can choose to think of it as I've created the causes and the conditions for this experience. So blaming the other person, they're just they are just the messenger, of my own past karmic um, causes and conditions. And so, it's kind of like in a past life, I slapped them, and now in this life, they're slapping me. They're completing this karmic circle, that I set in motion. So if I don't want more of this, I should stop creating the causes and the conditions to receive more of this. And I should see them as, someone that I myself have harmed in the past, and that, again, trying to see them through the eyes of wisdom and compassion and loving kindness, rather than as the other, as the enemy, as someone who is completely separate from me, who, isn't, um, who where I bear no responsibility for what is happening. This idea of the innocent victim, right? If you see yourself as the innocent victim in the situation, and you take no responsibility for what you're bringing into the interaction in terms of your own, again, expectations and the primacy of your own ego identity. And then also, if you want to, thinking about it in terms of karma, then um, these are ways that we can lessen or work with what is arising in our minds. So then stage three, um, again, so these are other ways of reframing the situation, bringing awareness and transformation. We can think of other people, the people who are not treating us well, not being kind. We can think about them as providing us opportunities for our own spiritual growth, recognizing that, you know, as a spiritual person, we've said, we have decided, we have expressed, I wish to become more patient. I wish to become more kind, more loving, more generous. And without opportunities to practice those things, those will never be realized, those aspirations that we ourselves hold. If everything goes well, if we're, just surrounded by people who support us and who encourage us and who are nice to us and who go out of their way, and nothing is ever difficult, nothing is ever painful, nothing is ever a challenge, then we won't have these opportunities to understand what is the current limit of my patience, what is the current limit of my loving kindness, my compassion. what am I able to transform? What am I able to bring onto my spiritual path versus what is triggering strong hatred, strong anger, strong aversion, and what am I not able to transform? What am I not able to bring on my spiritual path? What just sends me off into this destructive state of mind? Um, because of course we can work with really small inconveniences, um, but the larger and larger that they are, we begin to see what the limits of our capacity is. And that's really incredibly valuable information. So we can think how kind it is that we've been presented with opportunities to engage in spiritual growth by, not having everything be easy and supportive and beneficial. And without that, ultimately there will never be spiritual growth. There will never be, we'll never reach the goals that we've set out for ourselves. So these are really necessary catalysts for our own spiritual growth. So another way then of reframing is when we see other people engaging in these harmful actions, then going along with this idea, this understanding of seeing them as the object of our compassion rather than the object of our love is to recognize that, and we can join this with karma too if we wish, to see that, for oneself, we've talked about how in a past life, perhaps we've created the causes for this experience. And so our own karmic habit is now finishing, right? We created the causes to experience harm, and that harm is now being experienced. So we've closed that loop for ourselves. But this other person is just starting their karmic loop, right? They are by having hatred or whatever it is in their mind and relating to us in a harmful way, they are creating the causes for their own future suffering. Just like in the past, we created the causes for the suffering that we're experiencing now. So we can think that, and of course, the more intense the negativity is, the more harm, the more intensely they will experience the suffering in a future life. Um, and just like the suffering that we're experiencing now was created by quote unquote me, in the sense that the mind is the same mind, the same continuity of mind, but it's a past life, right? There was a different mother and father, there was a different probably world system, a different time and place. We have no memory of it. So no one's saying it's fair that this karmic loop is being closed in the suffering in this life where we don't remember who we were, what our name was, who we were the son or daughter of, and so on. Just like that, the unfairness of how that works is now, impacting this other sentient being. They're going to, in some future life, not have any idea why they're now experiencing a painful state. Um, so again, when we see the fundamental unfairness of how this all kind of unfolds over multiple lifetimes, that can fuel our strong desire to help sentient beings be free of the afflictions, to be free of the causes and the conditions that are giving rise to what is impelling their negative actions, our negative actions, and their negative actions. Okay, and so yeah, this is really short. Know, it's important to keep in mind that we're not being encouraged to be a doormat. Again, we're not encouraged to, we can set these healthy boundaries, but when we're setting these healthy boundaries, we don't do it out of a sense of a feeling of hatred for the other. We do it with wisdom and compassion. So this is what we'll come back to. So we won't do this quite yet. We will do the small group discussion. But are there any questions or thoughts, or comments that have arisen um, due to this introduction of this idea of forgiveness, letting go of hatred, letting go of resentment? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that, the Buddha taught, or at least one of the really valuable aspects of understanding karma, is that it puts us in the driver's seat of the process. We understand that this only exists because I created the causes and the conditions for it to exist. And also, this helps me to understand, if I don't want any more of this, what do? I have to stop. In this life, I've created the causes and the conditions for this to happen again and again, and I wish for that not to happen. And so, and then also, as you said, like, you've set the other person up for their own suffering now because of your unskillful action. Now they're under the influence of affliction, and now they're creating causes and the conditions for their suffering to it. So even in the moment, like, how do I respond without escalating this situation? How can I, like, they've already started to create negative karma by saying or doing, but if I make this worse, if I now respond with hatred, if I now insult them back, well, then that's going to feed their afflictions. They're going to get their hackles up even more, and they're going to be, and then it's just going to be, and so I also can take, so not only can I learn what not to do, like, in general, but in this, I can heal this relationship with this other person in the moment by not feeding their afflictions, by, like, you know really working on my own mind, and not making this even worse, even as it's unfolding. I can try to put an end to this, because this loop, if I now harm them back, well, now I'm creating another, process. And then it's just going to keep going back and forth, you know, really endlessly, until somebody achieves enlightenment and they quit it. Um, but yeah, it's a really powerful way of not seeing oneself as just the innocent victim, and really being able to understand that we can take responsibility for this, and we can do something, um, to put a stop to it, permanently. So ultimately, I mean, we can deconstruct with time, with energy, with effort, we can deconstruct the the parts of what we're bringing into it that are setting ourselves up as the target to begin with, um, by again softening our ego identity, not always needing to be right, not needing, um, not needing other people to agree with us, or not needing other people to believe in the same things that we believe in, or to, we can recognize that even if someone is causing harm in the world or causing harm to us, um, if we can take the focus away from it's what's called inappropriate attention, like in Buddhism. What one reason that we're the target is because we focus on this idea of poor me, innocent me, how dare this be happening to me. We don't think how terrible is it, that this person is dealing with these afflicted states. How terrible is it that they are suffering? And so if we focus on that instead of, it's like, where are we shining the spotlight? Where are we, what's important in this situation? Um, and if we can take the emphasis off of this shouldn't be happening to me, why is this happening to me? And we can just think about, how painful it must be for this other person, then compassion arises in the mind, and that feeling of compassion does relieve that sense of, naturally and spontaneously, um, we become more spacious, we become more open, we become more receptive. We see the other person not, when we see the other person as the enemy, then we see them like as a demon, right? We see them as the object of, what's harming me. They appear to us in a negative light, in a negative aspect, and that cuts off the mind of compassion. That cuts off the mind of loving kindness. And if we but those open, expansive minds are not suffering minds. They're interconnected minds. They're peaceful, open, ways of relating. And if we can actually be in that experience, then we don't suffer in that. Um, the suffering, what Buddhism would say is that difficulty is unavoidable, challenge is unavoidable, but suffering is layered on top of difficulty and challenge. Um, suffering comes from fighting against the present moment, from being averse to what is, um, and accepting what is, and working with what is, and transforming what is, can allow for something to be difficult and challenging, but without it actually feeling painful or, um, you know, feeling like I am suffering. Yeah, I mean, I don't, to some degree, it might be semantic in the, in the sense that, as we said, it's not about condoning negative behavior. We don't have to kid ourselves or pretend like something didn't happen or that something was, appropriate or inappropriate. We don't have to mislabel or misidentify or misunderstand. But it's just, when we ruminate about it, when we keep bringing it up in our, like, just when we're just on our own, and we just think, how dare they do that? How, after the fact, and then it colors, um, again, it's sort of about conflating the action with the person who engaged in the action. We can say this isn't an appropriate action. This action causes harm. I don't encourage, I don't want people to engage in, but the people who are engaging that, they have Buddha nature. I see them as an object of my love and compassion. I don't see the person as someone who I am averse to, who I feel distant from, who I reject, who I wish, who I see as someone who deserves to receive harm because of their mistaken actions. Um, so as long as we're not um, feeling in those negative ways toward the people that are engaging in these actions, then I think it's, perfectly valid and reasonable to still say, things like this ought not happen. Um, you know, and but again, recognizing that if they themselves were free of the afflictions, it wouldn't have happened. If they themselves didn't have any jealousy or malice or ill will or, in their own minds, they would never, of course, have acted in that way. So wishing for them to be free of that is what would ultimately release them from those mistaken ways of relating. Um, yeah, it's more about, like, do I feel disconnected from them? Am I othering them? Do I feel like it would be okay because they do this sort of thing? I would be okay if they came to harm, or I myself want to cause them to experience harm because they themselves cause harm. Those are really destructive ways of thinking about others, even if they themselves are engaging in inappropriate actions. Um, okay, so let me get the small group discussion on the, I don't know if I have it. Okay, so the questions are, what feels difficult, um, or about letting go of resentment, and how do you navigate the tension between letting go of resentment and maintaining boundaries? Um, that's the small group prompt. What feels difficult about letting go of resentment, and how do you navigate the tension between letting go and maintaining boundaries? So we'll do that for 15 minutes. Small group discussion. All right, so we'll finish with the meditation. So just find a comfortable upright position. Think about keeping your feet flat and your back straight, torso open. Hands in the lap, right over the left, with the palms upturned and the thumbs gently touching. Your eyes are gently closed or slightly open. Making sure you let in enough light to remain alert. And try to maintain an awareness of not slouching or leaning. Let go of pretending to the outside world, constraining your awareness just of the body and mind. And begin to concentrate your awareness in the present by attending closely to the physical sensations that accompany the in-breath and the out-breath in the space around the opening of the nostrils. Noticing quickly when anything other than that one physical sensation is arising in your mind, and judgment and frustration, lifting your awareness up from those distractions, and placing it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. Begin to bring to mind a situation where you're holding some resentment, you're holding a grudge. Think of the person or people involved. And begin to consider what internal causes and conditions in their lives might have contributed to their choices, their actions. Recognizing that just like oneself, they deeply wish to be happy, they deeply wish to be free of suffering. And just like oneself, as an ordinary sentient being, they find themselves often confused under the influence of afflicted states. This resentment negatively impacting my life. It's not in any way changing the past. By intruding on the present, it deprives me of my own content. Am I able to see that, oh, there may have been harm in the past, bringing that harm into the present is only compounding the difficulty. Imagine that there's a version of yourself seated in front of you, facing you. This version is caught up in that resentment. Observe that experience as painful. See them as suffering. And respond to that observation of suffering with compassion, wishing yourself to be free of it. Seeing it as something to put down, to let go of. Thinking of your anger as holding on to a burning coal. It's only oneself that's burned. And then imagine the person that you feel did the harming is in front of you, and see their pain and confusion, ignorance as suffering. Placing the blame on the afflicted states of mind that we're all subject to. Seeing how it is an obstacle to their happiness, their well-being. And try to see them through the lens of loving kindness and compassion, wishing them to be free of what motivates these unskillful, harmful actions. But holding the mind, the view of oneself as lighter, more free, more spacious. and of them as having everything that they need. Free of their burdens, their obstacles. Mm. Are there any thoughts or questions? Oh, well, there is the book, same kind of workbook if you're interested on the event page, as there is for all of the previous classes. If you have any interest in looking at that, you're welcome to. That's what it is. And so yeah, Venerable Yuntin will be here, and she gets her first class is on the 18th, which is a Thursday night. She's doing a standalone class on Thursday, another standalone class on Friday evening, and then Saturday workshop, and then she's doing a little bit Sunday, doing a lot of stuff. And then she's doing a retreat on the second, third, and fourth, Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, January, on building and deepening your spiritual practice. So kind of an interactive workshop. So she's she's at my Tripa College in Washington. All right, so yeah, we don't meet again until the 17th of next month, unfortunately, because of all of the meetings with the